Thank you, Linwood, for coming. This is pretty exciting for us here at the library. Plus, I'm huge fan of yours. I've read all your books, so I don't know if that's good or bad, but I have.
I have no objection. That's
okay. I must say I did borrow them from the library, though, so okay. So one thing about this new book, I thought maybe if it's okay with you, we'll talk about your new book, sure. And then we'll turn around and we'll talk a bit about your writing. And then I thought maybe few quirky personal questions, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
Good. Okay. So in this particular book, which I got to have the pleasure of having the first one to read it because I needed to get it read. It was tough. I was on vacation. I had to sit down and read it. So that was a tough job, but I did it. I noticed in past interviews, you talk about, you get your ideas from ordinary events that trigger it. What ordinary event triggered this Find You First?
I think it was, sometimes afterwards you've done a book, you think, where did this even come from? But there had been a sort of photo essay in the New York Times magazine a couple of years ago of a woman, I think it was a woman who had sort of gone across the country and taken photos of her recently discovered sort of half siblings, all of them product from the same sperm donation. And it was a nice human interest story and so forth. And like, as often the case with thriller writers, you think, well, how could that go horribly wrong? And so I think that might have been the sort of initial idea. And I had it sort of tucked away in my head for a while about doing something with that. And ultimately did. That turned into Find You First.
Oh, and it was excellent. One of the best parts, I think, is you always have twists in your plot, but this was like super amount of twists. I have to be very careful not to give anything away, they tell me. So, I found that there were some really great twists in this one Stephen King says it's your best book to date. Would you agree with that?
Well, I would be rude to argue with him. Maybe it is, I don't even know if it's my favorite. I think when you're the author, sometimes you don't have the perspective that others do. So I think, I'm not sure. I mean, a lot of times when you finish a book, you think, wow, this is just the worst thing I've ever done. And then once you get some feedback from editors and readers and so forth, think, okay. But I think it's one of the best concepts I'd ever had for a book. And it's, I think it really flies, it's got a lot of momentum to it. So, I think in my top 3, at least.
Yeah. Well, and especially with all the DNA stuff coming out with genealogy and that, it's like a topic that many people are familiar with, which you also claim you like to write things that are more everyday things. And that is true.
Yeah. And this is a book that I couldn't have written 10 or 15 years ago, because now we've reached a point where you can turn on the TV at night and there's ads for, send us a saliva sample and we'll tell you everything about you, and maybe even find some of your relatives you don't even know about. So that's such a new development. And so sometimes when I see these sort of, advances we've made in various areas, I think there might be a book in that. I mean, I did a book about 7 years ago called Trust Your Eyes. Yeah. That was really kind of inspired by the advent of a thing like Google Street View, where you could sit and travel the world virtually, without going anywhere. And so, but that's certainly true in this book.
Yeah, it was an interesting concept. But like I mentioned, it had a lot of plot twists. So did you come up with all the characters first, or did you literally plot out the plot first for this book? Well,
and I'll maybe quickly too tell everyone what the plot sort of is in a nutshell.
Okay, as long as you give it away, that's the good thing.
I won't give anything away. That's too bad. I mean, it's about a guy named Miles Cookson, in the early 40s. He's a guy in tech. He's made millions of dollars. And the only thing that they can't buy with that is time. And he has learned that he has a terminal illness that has a 50% chance being passed on to offspring. And everyone says, well, it's a good thing you never got married, never had kids. And what people don't know is that a couple decades ago, he was a sperm donor. So after a lot of soul searching, Miles thinks, well, maybe I should find these people, these grown children. And first of all, let them know that they should get themselves checked, but also who am I going to leave this great fortune to? And as he begins his quest to find these people, they all start vanishing one by one, every trace of them. And so that in a nutshell is the pitch. And so, I spent probably a couple of weeks or so just making notes about how the plot would work. And before I started writing it, I knew where I was going to end up. I knew what the basic story was. I knew who all the, who did what. But I didn't have the whole book plotted out. I didn't have it all figured out. So once I kind of knew the big picture, I thought I'm going to start writing. Because I find, when you start a book, it's kind of like, at least for me, it's like if you were in New York and you wanted to drive to Los Angeles, you know where you're going to end up, but there's 100 different ways to get there.
Yeah.
And so I don't often see the opportunities that exist in the book until I get into it and think, I could do this or I could do that. And so it's sort of half plotted out, but not all of it.
Okay. And so you obviously have some of your characters in line too when you start writing. How do you come up with their names? Are they names that you identify with the way the person looks or that you knew in the past?
No, names are a funny thing. I just kind of, I don't spend an awful lot of time on it. I just think, what name would work for this person? I know some authors want to find a name that seems to suit the character. And I think, well, that doesn't really happen in real life too much. I mean, you're born with this name and you become who you are. And so I don't kind of look for something like that. And sometimes, it used to be, back when I used to get way more spam than I would get now, I would find the names of people who sent me spam. I would decide, well, those would be the people, those are the names of people I'll kill. But no, I don't spend, sometimes I just get out the phone book or I look through Facebook, I look at names and think, yeah, that one works, this one works. But it doesn't slow me down too much.
Yeah, so that killing comment, I noticed on one of the interviews you did recently with Peter Swanson that he felt it was letting it out and you kind of disagreed. That didn't necessarily mean that mystery writers didn't feel the urge to kill like that. So I'm getting worried that you're kind of backing up that theory here. What I wanted to ask is, if you were to know Miles, would he be a friend of yours or a good neighbor or?
Well, Miles at the beginning he's kind of a jerk, I think. He's a pretty self-centered, driven individual. And I think his career has mattered to him more than anything else. I think he would be a hard guy to get to know. I'm not sure he'd be someone I'd hang out with, but I think over the course of the book, kind of goes through a bit of a transformation and becomes a more likable individual.
Absolutely, yeah. I noticed that very strongly, that there was quite a change in him in that. So, yeah. So talk about beginning and end. Did you find that the book changed drastically from what you thought you were going to write, or did you stay on target?
No, I pretty much stayed on target. I had known, I think there's at least two major twists later in the book, and I knew they were coming, and I knew what they were going to be. And sometimes when you're writing, you just can't wait to get to them because they're just going to be so much fun when you get there. But I knew that those were, and so, but it's it's sort of the smaller details that I don't really think about until I get to them. Think about how I'm going to do this. But the big picture, like I say, is something that I'm aware of. And for every writer that I know, they go at this differently. I mean, I've done a lot of events, become friends over the years with Ian Rankin, and Ian says he doesn't know. He writes the book to find out. And I think, well, I always make the analogy of that, I'm building a house and I wouldn't start building a house without a blueprint or a solid foundation. And so I know what this is going to kind of look like when it's done. And I always think second drafts are going back in and putting in furniture and putting up wallpaper and rearranging things, but the basic structure is sound. It's later drafts that you kind of work on details.
Well, that being said, did you take anything big out that you thought might end up in the book, but then decided it just didn't fit afterwards? Without giving it away?
No. I there's a character in the novel that people have said this appears to be a kind of Jeffrey Epstein inspired character. Which is true.
Yes.
It's true. Although in the first draft, he was much more like him than in the second. In the second draft, he's just as evil and as, corrupt and so forth as Epstein. But their parallels are not quite as strong. So I kind of, had a different kind of a career and so forth. But that too was that's a kind of parallel story in this novel. We're with Miles as he's trying to track down these possible, offspring of his. And over here in New York, we have these chapters with this other guy, this rather evil, very wealthy, well-connected influence peddler. And, we keep wondering, well, what does his story have to do with Miles's story? And it's all heading towards this kind of intersection later in the novel.
It's one of the things people say they like about your writing style. You will take all aspects of ordinary life. So you've got like, rich people, poor people, you've got like good people, bad people, but not like outlandishly ridiculous people. And then you've got like, Chloe has that big speech about knowing about death. Do we really have to know when we're going to die? I don't want to say too much, but which is a very human thing to say. And I just find you do that very well, that you incorporate just as if though you're just a plain person on the street, and your books are like that, which make them very enjoyable in that.
Well, thank you. I've always kind of wanted to write about ordinary people who get caught up in extraordinary situations. That what happens to Miles or to Chloe, who's the first of these possible children that he does find, and they connect and they go on this search together. This will be the biggest thing that ever happens to them, is what happens to them in this book, as opposed to, say, Jack Reacher, an elite child novel. I mean, this will be an amazing thing that happens to him, but he'll have another amazing thing happen to him in the next book. And so I kind of like to see how people who are in no way equipped to deal with the forces of evil, with bad guys, how they handle that situation, as opposed to someone like Jack Reacher. And I love those books. As opposed to Jack Reacher, I'm more worried about the people he encounters, because they're going to get the snot beat out of them.
So one more question on the book is, if you had to do a spin-off on one of those characters, which one would you pick?
I guess it would be Chloe. And she's, I think, one of the strongest characters in the book. I think she's really the only one you could spin out if I were to do a follow-up. I don't have any plans to do a follow-up with her, but she would be the one that you could do more with.
Okay. So I'm going to go a little bit into your writing style. I'll try not to ask questions that you get asked all the time. But you did write for newspapers for over 30 years.
Yeah.
Did you turn around and use any of the characters or any of the stories for any of your books?
I did. Yeah, I was true. I was working in newspapers for 3 decades. Most of it, 27 years or more so, with the Toronto Star, where I was but half of that time I was an editor, assistant city editor, news editor, all these different things, and then half of it as a columnist. The very first novel that I wrote, or first was published, was a sort of comic thriller called Bad Move, about a character named Zack Walker. And some of the incidents in that book are very loosely inspired by some of the stuff that happened that I dealt with as an editor when I was fairly new at the paper. So that was the incident. That incident was kind of inspired, but for the most part, the influence of newspapers on my work has been more in terms of work ethic as opposed to material. So especially when you're writing for a newspaper, when you're doing a column, you can't call into the desk and say, the muse just didn't strike me today, so I don't think I'll do a column. I'm just sitting here waiting for inspiration. So, but it's so working at newspapers taught me that writing is a job, that you sit down and you go to work and you produce. And because, you don't have an option when you work newspaper, that's your job, is to produce. And so that all carried through with this. And also the whole notion of deadlines. I mean, deadlines are, everything working in newspapers. So if I'm, supposed to deliver a rewrite on a book or deliver a manuscript by a certain date, it's very likely that my editors are going to get it earlier than they asked for. So it's had that kind of influence.
So it was kind of a good thing you did your newspaper first, like you're saying. Is there after 30 years, what made you decide to take the plunge? I know you spoke in the past, and I know when I read your memoir years ago, you said you always were writing a bit. But what made you decide to just finally cut it with the newspaper and go and be an author?
Well, I starting around 2003, I was still doing the column. I was doing 3 columns a week, but I wrote that book, Bad Move, that I just mentioned, that sort of comic thriller. And we found a publisher for that in New York. Bantam in New York bought it. And Bantam eventually wanted 3 more novels about that character. So I was still writing 120 or 130 columns a year. And I was writing a book a year, a thriller a year for Bantam. And it was kind of killing me, because I was using up vacation time to finish up working on a book and so forth. And so then I wrote the 5th novel I wrote was a book called No Time for Goodbye. And that book just, to backstep a bit, I wrote these 4 sort of comic thrillers, which sold very modestly. And my agent said, you might want to think about not writing a comic thriller, not doing a series, doing something different, what she called a big book. And so I started thinking about what to do, and I came up with this idea that became the book No Time for Goodbye. And that book kind of went supernova. We first sold it for a much bigger advance in the US, then we sold it in Germany, then we sold it in the UK, for enough that I decided I could take a year off from the paper to write the next book. So I was going to take a year's leave of absence. And then during that time, No Time for Goodbye got picked by something called the Richard and Judy show in England. It became a Richard and Judy book club pick, which over there would be the equivalent kind of getting picked by Oprah. And so that novel finished out 2008 as the single best-selling novel of the year in the UK. And so at that stage, it became clear that if I decided to quit the day job, the newspaper job, I would be okay. Because I realized I was, instead of taking, I'm very, at least financially conservative. And I didn't want to take the kind of a leap where I would leave a secure job to take a chance on writing just novels. And first of all, who quits a job with a dental plan, right? So
that's true.
So when I realized that the books had reached a level where they would make me more or multiples of what the Toronto Star was paying me, I thought, okay, I'm going to quit. So it was a financial decision. I thought, I'm now able to do that.
Well, interesting you should mention your first 4 books, because I have to be honest with you. The Zack Walker series is the first books I read that were yours. And they were actually what turned me on to your reading. I thoroughly enjoyed them. And I was kind of dismayed. I mean, I really like your new stuff too, but I thought, I've heard you talk before that, they wanted you to change in that. And I just thought, well, that's too bad, because I really, really enjoyed that series. And your writing style, the humor in it and that, it didn't make it like a light, cozy mystery. I felt it was a step above that, which is what I enjoyed, right? So it's interesting you should bring that up.
They were, I loved writing them. There are 4 of them, and I was very happy, I'm very proud of them. I think they're great books. But, they weren't selling at the time.
Yeah.
And the good news is that the newer books, the standalones, have attracted a big audience, and now people have gone back and found those books. So
yes.
they're still being read. But I wrote the last Zack book in 2006. So, it's been 15 years since I got into the Zack's head. So it'd be very hard to go back to it now. And my publisher's clamoring for me to do more Zack books. Every once in a while, there's this little nibble about maybe doing a TV series about Zack. And then I thought, well, if that ever happened, maybe I'd do more. But that's, I think that Zack's return is unlikely.
A TV series would be kind of funny. That would be a good one to watch.
Yeah, I think it would be. With the right touch, it could be a good show. But, and I've had, there have been some discussions, but nothing that so far has led to anything.
Which brings us to your Promise Falls trilogy. Did that start as one book, or did it a trilogy from the beginning and then suddenly there was a 4th book? Like, was that a plan?
Yeah, well, the 4th one wasn't, but I had been thinking about doing something that was sort of more ambitious, something a bit different. And and so the Promise Falls trilogy are the books Broken Promise, Far From True, and the 23. And so I figured out, before I wrote any of them, I thought, okay, here's what the 3 books would be, or here's the story, that the line that runs through all 3 of them. And so it began with that idea right from the beginning. And so, and because I was worried that, that the second or third book would, or the first book would be out, and I'd realized that I needed to make changes to it to accommodate books 2 or 3. So I just wrote all 3 of them in 15 months. And
Wow.
so that meant that by the time I was just doing the final page proofs for the first book, I was writing the third. And if there were any things that I thought I needed to set up, I was able to do it, make some last minute fixes in the first book. So I wrote them all very closely together. But I have to say, I wouldn't do it again. I mean, I think that the trilogy is really a lot of fun. And I did write one other book called Parting Shot, which I call book 4 of the trilogy.
Yes.
My skills in math are kind of limited, but Parting Shot is a novel that kind of takes place a year after the events of the trilogy. So it follows the trilogy, but it's not like you have to read the trilogy to read Parting Shot. So, but what I found was that writing a trilogy became a marketing nightmare, because the publishers didn't really want to say it at the beginning, at the outset, that it was a trilogy, because then they thought, well, people won't buy the first book until the third one is out and they can read them all at once. So they didn't want to push that angle, but then people bought the first book and got to the end and it wasn't resolved, so they got mad. And because we had told them that it was a trilogy. So I'm not going to do that again.
Okay. Well, it's true. It does get frustrating when you're like, and he only writes once a year. So now I've got to wait, 12 months before I see it again, Along with trilogies, and you've done like light mysteries, you then went into writing 2 junior books, which I must say, I was very dismayed with you taking that. I thought I should read them because, they're the only 2 books of yours I hadn't read. So I picked up Chase about a month and a half ago, and I read it. And I was really disappointed that you didn't make that an adult book, because I found it excellent. And I was like, and it was a cliffhanger. And not till today did I get book 2. So for 6 weeks, I have been waiting for the next book. So I was like, okay, that really should have been an adult book. It would have been a perfect one. I did notice that it's pretty well the first few chapters of your memoir, Chipper, your dog, and all that. So what made you decide to go into a junior book?
So, and yeah, you're right. Escape, which is the second part of those 2 books, really kind of begins within hours of the end of the first book. And I one night, as sometimes happen, I woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and I had this idea, this fully formed idea, pretty much, about a dog that's part of sort of some secret organization that is implanted with all kinds of software that would allow this dog to be used in surveillance work, in espionage kind of work. And so the dog's able to read, it can communicate, it can do all these sort of things. But the dog's not really working out because it keeps wanting to, be in the middle of a mission and rather chase a squirrel or go after a cat or something. And so the people who are running this institute decide that this dog's not working out. They're gonna have to put him down and take all the software out, use it for another dog. And the dog's smart enough to know this is going to happen, so he escapes. And for reasons that take a while to find out, he has to find one particular boy. And so in the morning, I said to my wife, Neith, I said, I'd had this idea. And she said, you have to write that. And I said, yeah, but it's not really the subject matter of the kind of thing I would do for my adult book. And she said, well, then don't write it for them. She said, and my wife, is a former kindergarten teacher. And she said, all kids will love this story, but especially boys who are reluctant readers. And so I thought, okay, I'll do it. And I talked to my publishers and we had some discussions about it. So I ended up writing the 2 books about this dog who's called Chipper. And, but I just did the 2. I just did the 2 of them. And, but they got, the Silver Birch Award in Ontario, they picked it as their favorite. They won the Silver Birch Award, and the Canadian crime writers award for novels for a young audience. Both books won the award for that. So they were well received in some communities. But it's true that the first book, a lot of it is inspired in part about my teenage years when I was essentially running a trailer park and cottage resort in the Cotswolds near Bob Cajun, which my parents bought when I was about 11. And I essentially started running at the age of 16 when my dad died. So that environment of that camp, of that trailer park and the cottage resort shows up in 3 books of mine. It certainly shows up in my memoir, because it's my memoir, Last Resort, is all about that. And then that environment I also used in one of the Zack books in Lone Wolf. I set it in an environment like that. And then when I started doing this, I thought, yeah, I'm gonna go back to that well again and use that setting.
Yeah, I just love them. I just thought great. I was like, man, they could have been a fully fleshed out book for adults. I would have been perfectly happy with that too. Was there an author that you really didn't like at the beginning, but then when you tried him later on or a few years later, you decided he was a good author?
That's actually a good question, because I never thought of that part, but I can say yes. A few years ago, I read, he's now no longer with us, Philip Kerr, who wrote the Bertie Gunther novels about a police detective in sort of Nazi Germany. And I read the first one and I really struggled with it, couldn't get into it. And I didn't get, and then a few years later, I went back to him. And then during the pandemic, I read everything. Like, I mean, sometimes I think it's not the author's fault, it's the reader's fault that they came at it at the wrong time or they were too busy with something else. And then I went back to it and I reread the one that I'd started before and I went, this is just genius. And then I read all of the, I think I found the last a few months ago, and I've now read all of the Bertie Gunther novels that Philip Kerr wrote. And I just was in awe of what he could do. He's one of those kind of authors that when you read them, you think, boy, am I glad you don't have to be this good to get published.
Well, along that line, have you ever thought of writing under a pseudonym or?
Not really. There's a book that I have written that's going to come out, I think, next year, that was different enough that we debated at first whether to do it under another name. But in particular in the UK, where I do really, really well, they thought, well, we don't want to bring out a book by you under another name. We want it under your name. And it's more of what I would call a Michael Crichton kind of a thriller. Oh, yeah. And I describe it as, think Jurassic Park, but instead of dinosaurs, it's self-driving cars. Mm-hmm. We signed the contract on it. It's going to come out next year. But we're not even sure what format. Like, we might just bring it out as an ebook. We might bring it as a paperback original. They might bring it out as a paperback in the UK, but not in the US. So that's all to be worked out. But we have a title, and it's called Look Both Ways.
Okay, that makes sense. Yes. Yeah. Are they going to be like Stephen King, Christine cars? Is that what they are?
I describe it as. So the plot line is a Tesla type company figures that the best way to test autonomous or self-driving cars is if every car on the road is one, because then they all communicate with each other. They all, they're like a hive mind, a collective. And so they go to a kind of Martha's Vineyard type community, an island community that's heavily populated, and they say, we're going to do an experiment here. Everybody surrenders their conventional cars and puts them on the mainland, and we're going to give everybody one of these cars for a month and do a test. And a virus gets introduced into the system, and all the cars essentially become homicidal. And so it is like an island with 1,000 Christines on it.
Ooh, I love it already.
and in fact, the author of that Christine one has already read it, and he loved it. So even though we don't know that.
He who shall remain nameless, is it? Yeah. A couple more, because it's wonderful the time you've given us. In 2014, you said the film Notting Hill was your guilty pleasure. So like 7 years later, is it still your guilty pleasure, or have you acquired a new one?
I have a bunch of them. Notting Hill is the kind of a movie that I think, Oh, I really should admit that I really like that, but I really do. And a lot of it has to do with Hugh Grant, who I really enjoy, and his running the bookshop and his connection with everybody. And it's, I do kind of like it. But there are other movies that, I'm flipping through the dial sometime. And if I land on any of the Bourne trilogy movies, the first three with Matt Damon, I'll always just stop, because it doesn't matter where you are. It doesn't matter which movie it is. You can just instantly pick it up and watch it.
Yes.
That's one and that's not a guilty pleasure. I mean, those are brilliantly done movies.
So you once said in an interview that success is defined by sales, reviews, how fulfilling writing is, and that you always ask other authors, are you happy, as a measure of success. So let me ask you, as we wrap this up, are you happy?
That's a good question. I do ask that of others. I'll tell you a quick story. So I was at an event one time, and I was having breakfast with another author her career wasn't going the way she had hoped. And she was looking at me and thinking, if I could only get where you are. And I said, I'm not happy. I'm not happy with how I'm doing. I wanted her to be here, or I wanted this or whatever. And sitting next to us was an author who I won't name, but there's hardly anybody in the world who's doing better. And I said, let's ask him if he's happy. And so she turned, and she knows him, and she said, are you happy? And he thought about it for a minute, and he said, no. And so I said, if he can't be happy, none of us can be happy.
Oh.
But I think that, I have a friend a guy who's become a good friend during the pandemic. We have a Zoom chat about every 3 weeks, and he has a long career in television and producing and writing and novels. Very successful guy in the US. And he called, somebody said to him one time, what's it like to be a writer? And he said, it's a constant battle with doubt. And I thought that was genius, because when you create something, you're never really sure if it's working or not. And you're often full of, doubts about your own work, and don't know if it's working, and so forth. And every time something comes out, you think, yeah, that was great, but God, it could have been better, or I should have done this. So I think that one of the reasons we keep writing is because we're trying to get to this perfect book, and we're never quite satisfied. And so, I would say generally happy, but content, probably not. You're always trying to do something better than what you've done before, and that's always the trick. Mr. King said it's the best book I've ever done. I think, well, why bother now?
No good.
Like the next book is written, and I'm thinking, is it as good as this one? I don't know. And so every time you do a book, you think, I want this to be the best one I've ever done. And some years you think, yeah, I did it. And other years you think, well, this will get me by, until the next one. And so there's a lot of introspection and so forth with writers. Writers are terrible people to live with, really. Ask any writer's spouse that it's exhausting.
It's exhausting if your child is a writer too. Yes, absolutely.
Oh yeah.
Totally exhausting to be a parent of a writer. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, just curious, I know you told us about the one with the cars, but do you have an idea for your next other book that's coming out? I heard you mention something about Zoom.
Well, no, I've thought, so actually next year, if we bring out that car book next year, maybe in the summer, so that's done. And I've done 2 drafts on the sort of regular annual thriller. That's done.
Wow.
So I would have to start probably writing, because I'm on a book a year schedule, and so actually this week I got an idea that I thought might be the next book, and which I don't really need to start writing till September, October, but I started making notes on it. So I'm in good shape, because you're just waiting for like this one idea to be floating in the ether somewhere. It has to find you, and if you can just get one a year that you're happy with, then you're all set. So I'm in not bad shape. Sorry, go ahead.
We got you for another 2 years at least, what you're saying at this point, right?
I think so, yeah. Unless, I think I'll just, every once in a while, people say, well, why don't you're going to retire? And I think, well, what I do,
Yeah.
in fact, it's my wife who says, what will you do? And, and, and so I think as long as I can keep the plot straight, and haven't lost my marbles, I'll probably just keep doing this.
That's excellent news. I'm really glad to hear that. So, well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really, really appreciate that. You're a great person to talk to. I've enjoyed all your interviews I watched, So, like I said, thank you very, very much, Linwood.